But the case is altered now. To afford an idea of the sympathy and goodwill with which the different members of the Austrian family were taught to regard me, said the emperor, it is sufficient to mention that one of the young archdukes frequently burned his dolls, which he called roasting Napoleon. He afterwards declared he would not roast me any more, for he loved me very much, because I had given his sister Louisa plenty of money to buy him playthings. Since my return to Europe, I have had an opportunity of ascertaining the sentiments entertained by the House of Austria towards Napoleon. In Germany, a person of distinction informed me that having had a private audience of the Emperor Francis during his tour in Italy in 1816, the conversation turned on Napoleon. Francis spoke of him in the most respectful terms. One might almost have supposed, said my informant, that he still regarded him as the ruler of France, and that he was ignorant of his captivity at St. Helena. He never alluded to him by any other title than the Emperor Napoleon. I learned from the same individual that the Archduke John, when in Italy, visited a rotunda on the ceiling of which was painted a celebrated action of which Napoleon was the hero. As he raised his head to look at the painting, his hat fell off, and one of his attendants stooped to pick it up. "Let it be," said he. "It is thus that I should contemplate the man who is there portrayed. Now that I am on this subject, I will note down a few particulars which I collected in Germany since my return to Europe, and to mark the degree of credit to which they are entitled, I may mention that I obtained them from individuals holding high diplomatic posts. Everyone knows that these members of diplomatic corps form among themselves a sort of family, a kind of Freemasonry, and that their sources of information are of the most authentic kind. The Empress Maria Louisa complained that when she quitted France, Maire de Talleyrand reserved to himself the honour of demanding from her the restitution of the crown jewels, and ascertaining whether they had been restored with the most scrupulous exactness. In 1814, during the disasters of France, many tempting and brilliant proposals were made to Prince Eugene. An Austrian general offered him the crown of Italy in the name of the Allies, on condition of his joining them. This offer afterwards came from a still higher source, and was several times repeated. During the reign of the emperor, there had been some idea of raising the prince to a throne, and those of Portugal, Naples, and Poland were thought of. In 1815, men of high influence in European diplomacy endeavoured to sound his opinions, with the view of ascertaining whether, in case Napoleon should again be constrained to abdicate, and the choice should fall on him, he would accept the crown. On this occasion, as on every other, the prince steadily pursued a line of duty and honour which will immortalize him. Honour and fidelity was his constant reply, and posterity will make it his device. On the distribution of states in 1814, the Emperor Alexander, who frequently visited the Empress Josephine at Malmaison, signified a wish to procure for her son the sovereignty of Genoa. Eugene, however, declined this proposition, at the instigation of the ruling diplomatists, who falsely flattered him with the hope of something better. At the Congress of Vienna, the Emperor Alexander, who honoured Prince Eugene with particular marks of favour, insisted that he should be made the sovereign of at least 300,000 subjects. He testified the sincerest friendship for him, and they were every day seen walking about together arm in arm. The landing at Cannes put a period, if not to the sentiment, at least to the manifestation of it, and changed the political interests of the Emperor of Russia. The Austrian government even entertained the idea of seizing the person of Prince Eugene and sending him a prisoner to a fortress in Hungary, but the King of Bavaria, his father-in-law, indignantly represented to the Emperor of Austria that Eugene had gone to Vienna under his protection and guarantee, and that they should not be violated. Thus Eugene remained free on his own private parole and that of the king, his father-in-law. So late as 1814, gold 20 and 40 franc pieces were struck at Milan with the head of Napoleon and the date of 1814. Either from motives of economy or some other cause, no new die had yet been engraved. After the fall of Napoleon, Alexander on several occasions manifested a marked and decided dislike to him. In 1815 he was the promoter of the Second Crusade against Napoleon. He directed every hostile measure with the utmost degree of malice, and seemed to make it almost a personal affair, alleging, as the cause of his aversion, that he had been deceived and trifled with. If this tardy resentment was not a mere pretence, there is every reason to believe that it was stirred up by an old confidant of Napoleon, who, in private conversations, had artfully wounded the vanity of Alexander by statements, true or false, of the private opinion of Napoleon with regard to his illustrious friend. In 1814, there appeared reason to believe that Alexander would not be averse to see young Napoleon placed on the throne of France. After the emperor's second abdication, he seemed far less favourably disposed to the continuance of Napoleon's dynasty. In the Second Crusade, the Emperor Alexander marched at the head of innumerable forces. He was heard to declare at that period that the war might last for 3 years, but that Napoleon would nevertheless be subdued in the end. On the first intelligence of the Battle of Flaine-Rousse, the chiefs of all the Russian columns received orders immediately to halt, while all the Austrian and Bavarian corps instantly turned off, with the view of detaching themselves and forming a separate force. Had the Congress of Vienna been broken up on the 20th of March, it is almost certain that the crusade would not have been renewed, and had Napoleon been victorious at Waterloo, it is also tolerably certain that the Congress would have been dissolved. The news of Napoleon's landing at Cannes was a thunderbolt to the French plenipotentiary at Vienna. He indeed drew up the famous declaration of the 13th of March, and however virulent it might be, the first draft was still more so. It was amended by other ministers. The countenance of this plenipotentiary, as he gradually learned the advance of Napoleon, was a sort of thermometer which excited the risibility of all the members of the Congress. Austria soon knew what part to act. Her couriers admirably well informed her of all that was passing. Members of the French legation alone were involved in doubt. They, however, circulated a magnanimous letter from the king to the other sovereigns, informing them that he was resolved to die at the Tuileries, though it was known that Louis had already left the capital and was on his way to the frontier. A member of the Congress and Lord Wellington held a confidential conversation with the members of the French legation, and with the map in their hands, assigned the 20th or 21st for Napoleon's entrance into Paris. As the Emperor Francis received the official publications from Grenoble and Lyon, he regularly forwarded them to Schönbrunn, to Maria Louisa, to whom they afforded extreme joy. It is very true that at a somewhat later period an idea was entertained of seizing young Napoleon in order to convey him to France. The French plenipotentiary at length quitted Vienna and proceeded to Frankfurt and Wiesbaden, whence he could more conveniently negotiate either with Ghent. Never was a courtier thrown into greater embarrassment and anxiety by the turn of events. The ardour with which he had been inspired on receiving the intelligence of Napoleon's landing at Cannes was very much abated when he heard of the Emperor's arrival at Paris, and he entered into an understanding with Fouché that the latter should be his guarantee with Napoleon, pledging himself, on the other hand, to be Fouché's guarantee with the Bourbons. There is good ground for believing that the offers made by this plenipotentiary to the new sovereign went very great lengths indeed, but Napoleon indignantly rejected them, lest, as he said, he should degrade his policy too far. In 1814, before M. de Talleyrand declared himself for the Bourbons, he was for the Regency, in which, however, he himself wished to play the principal part. Events fatal to the Napoleon dynasty prevented this moment of uncertainty from being turned to good account. Everything tends to prove that the result which was at that period adopted was far from being agreeable to the intentions of Austria, that power was duped, betrayed, or at least carried by assault. The fatality attending the military movements was such that the Allies entered Paris without the concurrence of the Austrian cabinet. Alexander's famous declaration against Napoleon Bonaparte and his family was also made without the Austrian power being consulted, and the Count d'Artois only entered France by contriving to slip in secretly in spite of the orders at the Austrian headquarters, where he had been refused passports. It appears that Austria, on the retreat from Moscow, exerted sincere efforts in London for negotiating a peace with Napoleon, but the influence of the Russian cabinet was all-powerful in London, and no proposals for peace were listened to. The armistice of Dresden then arrived, and Austria declared herself favourable to war. During this interval, the Austrian minister in London could never obtain a hearing. He, however, remained for a considerable time in the English capital, and left it only when the Allies had reached the heart of France, and when Lord Castlereagh felt a momentary foreboding that the heroic success of Napoleon might render negotiations indispensable. If this minister had not previously been sent to London, he would have been destined for Paris, and there probably his influence might have brought about a turn of negotiations different from those which arose during his absence between the Tuileries and Vienna. In the height of the crisis, he found himself detained in England as if by force. In his impatience to reach the grand centre of negotiations, he quitted his post and proceeded to Holland, braving the fury of the tempest. No sooner had he arrived on the theatre of events than he fell into the hands of Napoleon at Saint-Dizier, but the fate of France was then decided, though the fact was not yet known at the French headquarters. Alexander was entering Paris. The Austrian minister in London exerted every endeavour to procure a passport to enable him to join his sovereign by passing through Calais and Paris, but in vain. This circumstance, whether accidental or premeditated, was another fatality. But for this disappointment, the Austrian minister would have reached Paris before the Allies, would have joined Maria Louisa, would have defeated the last projects of M. de Talleyrand, and would have altogether produced new combinations. Opinion was divided in the Austrian cabinet. One party was for the union with France, the other was for the alliance with Russia. Intrigue or chance decided in favour of Russia, and Austria was thus merely led on. 14th. The coffee that was served at our breakfast this morning was better than usual. It might even have been called good. The Emperor expressed himself pleased with it. Some moments after he observed, placing his hand on his stomach, that he felt the benefit of it. It would be difficult to express what were my feelings on hearing this simple remark. The Emperor, by thus, contrary to his custom, appreciating so trivial an enjoyment, unconsciously proved to me the effect of all the privations he had suffered, but of which he never complained. When we returned from our evening walk, the Emperor read to me a chapter on the provisional consuls, which he had dictated to M. de Montholon. Having finished reading, the Emperor took a piece of ribbon and began to tie together the loose sheets of paper. It was late. The silence of night prevailed around us. My reflections at this moment took a melancholy turn. I gazed on the Emperor. I looked on those hands which had wielded so many sceptres, and which were now tranquilly, and, perhaps not without some degree of pleasure, occupied in the humble task of tying together a few sheets of paper. On these sheets, indeed, were traced events that will never be forgotten, portraits that will decide the judgment of posterity. It is the book of life or death to many whose names are recorded in it. These were the reflections that passed in my mind. And the Emperor, thought I, reads to me what he writes. He familiarly asks my opinion, and I freely give it. After all, am I not rather to be envied than pitied in my exile at St. Helena? 15th. Immediately after dinner, the Emperor walked in his favourite path. He had his coffee carried down to him in the garden, and he drank it as he walked about. The conversation turned on love. I must have made some very fine and sentimental remarks on this important subject, for the Emperor laughed at what he styled my prattle, and said that he understood none of my romantic verbiage. Then, speaking with an air of levity, he wished to make me believe that he was better acquainted with sensations than sentiments. I made free to remark that he was trying to be thought worse than he was described to be in the authentic but very secret accounts that were circulated about the palace. "And what was said of me?" resumed he with an air of gaiety. "Sire," I replied, "it is understood that when in the summit of your power you suffered yourself to be enslaved by the chains of love, that you became a hero of romance. In short, that you conceived an attachment for a lady in humble circumstances, that you wrote her above a dozen love letters, and that her power over you prevailed so far as to compel you to disguise yourself, and to visit her secretly and alone at her own residence in the heart of Paris." "And how came this to be known?" said he, smiling, which of course amounted to an admission of the fact. "And it was doubtless added," continued he, that was the most imprudent act of my whole life, for had my mistress proved treacherous, what might not have been my fate alone and disguised, in the circumstances in which I was placed, amidst the snares with which I was surrounded. But what more is said of me? Sire, it is affirmed that your Majesty's posterity is not confined to the King of Rome. The secret chronicle states that he has 2 elder brothers, one, the offspring of a fair foreigner whom you loved in a distant country, the other, the fruit of a connection nearer at hand, in the bosom of your own capital. It was asserted that both had been conveyed to Malmaison before our departure, the one brought by his mother, and the other introduced by his tutor, and they were described to be the living portraits of their father. The Emperor laughed much at the extent of my information, as he termed it, and being now in a merry vein, he began to take a frank retrospect of his early years, relating many of the love affairs and humorous adventures in which he had been engaged. He mentioned a supper that took place in the neighbourhood of the Saône at the commencement of the Revolution, and at which he had been present in company with Desmazis. He described the whole with the utmost pleasantry. Damases, he observed, was a good-natured fellow, or his patriotic eloquence might have proved fatal when opposed to the contrary doctrines of the other guests, and might even have brought him into some serious scrape. You and I, he continued, were at that time very far from each other. Not so very far in point of distance, sire, I replied, though certainly very remote with respect to doctrines. At that time I was also in the neighbourhood of the Saône, on one of the quays of Lyons, where crowds of patriots were declaiming against the cannon which they had just discovered in some boats, and which they termed a counter-revolution. I very unopportune proposed that they should make sure of the cannon, by administering to them the civic oath. However, I narrowly escaped being hanged for my folly. You see, sire, that I might at that time have balanced your account, had any disaster befallen you among the aristocrats. This was not the only curious approximation that was mentioned in the course of the evening. The emperor, having related to me an interesting circumstance that took place in 1789, said, "Where were you at that time?" "Sire," replied I, after a few moments' recollection, "I was then at Martinique, supping every evening with the future Empress Josephine." A shower of rain came on, and we were obliged to retire from our favourite path, which, the emperor observed, we might probably at a future period look back to with pleasure. "Perhaps so," I replied, "but certainly that will." It is said that a codicil in the emperor's will, which, however, must remain secret, completely confirms the above conjectures, not be until we have forsaken it for ever. Meanwhile, we must content ourselves with naming it the path of philosophy, since it cannot be called the path of Lethe. The Faubourg Saint-Germain, the emperor's freedom from prejudice and ill will, the characteristic language. 16th. Today the emperor put some questions to me relative to the Faubourg Saint-Germain, the last bulwark of the old aristocracy, that refuge of old-fashioned prejudices, the Germanic League as he called it. I told him that before his last misfortune his power had extended into every part of it, it had been invaded, and its name alone remained, it had been shaken and vanquished by glory, and that the victories of Austerlitz and Jena and the triumph of Tilsit had achieved its conquest. The younger portion of the inhabitants, and all who had generous hearts, could not be insensible to the glory of their country. The emperor's marriage with Maria Louisa gave the finishing stroke to this conversation. The few malcontents who remained were either those whose ambition had not been gratified, and who are to be found in all classes, or some obstinate old men and silly old women bewailing their past influence. All reasonable and sensible persons had yielded to the superior talents of the head of the state, and endeavoured to console themselves for their losses in the hope of a better prospect for their children. This was the point towards which all their ideas were directed. They gave the emperor credit for his partiality to old family names. They agreed that anyone else in his place would have annihilated them. They prized very highly the confidence with which the emperor had collected individuals of ancient families about his person, and they valued him no less for the language he had made use of in making choice of their children to serve in the army. These names belong to France and to history. I am the guardian of their glory. I will not allow them to perish. These and other such expressions had gained him numbers of proselytes. The emperor here expressed his apprehension that sufficient favour had not been shown to this party. "My system of amalgamation," said he, "required it. I wished and even directed favours to be conferred on them, but the ministers, who were the great mediators, never properly fulfilled my real intentions in that respect, either because they had not sufficient foresight, or because they feared that they might thus create rivals for favour and diminish their own chances. M. Talleyrand, in particular, always showed great opposition to such a measure, and always resisted my favourable intentions towards the old nobility. I observed, however, that the greater part of those whom he had placed near him had soon shown themselves attached to his person, that they had served him conscientiously, and had, generally speaking, remained faithful to him at the critical moment. The emperor did not deny it, and even went so far as to say that the twofold event of the king's return and his own abdication must naturally have had great influence on certain doctrines, and that, for his own part, he could see a great difference between the same conduct pursued in 1814 and in 1815. And here I must observe that since I had become acquainted with the emperor's character, I have never known him to evince, for a single moment, the least feeling of anger or animosity against those individuals who had been most to blame in their conduct towards him. He gives no great credit to those who distinguished themselves by their good conduct. They had only done their duty. He is not very indignant against those who acted basely. He partly saw through their characters. They yielded to the impulse of their nature. He speaks of them coolly and without animosity, attributing their conduct in some measure to existing circumstances, which he acknowledged were of a very perplexing nature, and threw the rest to the account of human weakness. Vanity was the ruin of Marmont. Posterity will justly cast a shade upon his character, said he, yet his heart will be more valued than the memory of his career. The conduct of Augereau was the result of his want of information and the baseness of those who surrounded him, that of Berthier, of his want of spirit and his absolute nullity of character. I remarked that the latter had let slip the best and easiest opportunity of rendering himself forever illustrious, by frankly rendering his submission to the king and entreating his majesty's permission to withdraw from the world, and mourn in solitude the fate of him who had honoured him with the title of his companion in arms and had called him his friend. Yes, said the emperor, even this step, simple as it was beyond his power. His talents, his understanding, said I, had always been a subject of doubt with us. Your Majesty's choice, your confidence, your great attachment surprised us exceedingly. To say the truth, replied the emperor, Berthier was not without talent, and I am far from disavowing his merit or my partiality for him, but his talent and merit were special and technical. Beyond a limited point he had no mind whatever, and then he was so undecided. I observed that he was, notwithstanding, full of pretensions and pride in his conduct towards us. Do you think, then, that the title of favourite stands for nothing? Said the emperor. I added that he was very harsh and overbearing. And what, said he, my dear Las Cassé, is more overbearing than weakness, which feels itself protected by strength? Look at women, for example. Berthier accompanied the emperor in his carriage during his campaigns. As they drove along, the emperor would examine the Audiobook and the report of the positions, whence he formed his resolutions, adopted his plans, and arranged the necessary movements. Berthier noted down his directions, and at the first station they came to, or during the first moments allotted to rest, whether by night or by day, he made out, in his turn, all the orders and individual details with admirable regularity, precision, and dispatch. This was a kind of duty at which he shewed himself always ready and indefatigable. This was the special merit of Berthier, said the emperor. It was most valuable to me. No other talent could have made up for the want of it. I now return to notice some characteristic traits of the emperor. He invariably speaks with perfect coolness, without passion, without prejudice, and without resentment, of the events and the persons connected with his life. He seems as though he could be equally capable of becoming the ally of his most cruel enemy, and of living with the man who had done him the greatest wrong. He speaks of his past history as if it had occurred 3 centuries ago, in his recitals and observations. He speaks the language of past ages. He is like a spirit discoursing in the Elysian fields. His conversations are true dialogues of the dead. He speaks of himself as of a third person, noticing the emperor's actions, pointing out the faults with which history may reproach him, and analysing the reasons and the motives which might be alleged in his justification. He never can excuse himself, he says, by throwing blame on others, since he never followed any but his own decision. He may complain, at the worst, of false informations, but never of bad counsel. He surrounded himself with the best possible advisers, but he always adhered to his own opinion, and he was far from repenting of so doing. It is, said he, the indecision and anarchy of agents which produce anarchy and feebleness in results. In order to form a just opinion respecting the faults produced by the sole personal decision of the emperor, it will be necessary to throw into the scale the great actions of which he would have been deprived, and the other faults which he would have been induced to commit by those very counsels which he is blamed for not having followed. In viewing the complicated circumstances of his fall, he looks upon things so much in a mass, and from so high a point, that individuals escape his notice. He never evinces the least symptom of virulence towards those of whom it might be supposed he has the greatest reason to complain. His greatest mark of reprobation, and I have had frequent occasion to notice it, is to preserve silence with respect to them, whenever they are mentioned in his presence. But how often has he not been heard to restrain the violent and less reserved expressions of those about him? You are not acquainted with men, he said to us. They are difficult to comprehend if one wishes to be strictly just. Can they understand or explain even their own characters? Almost all those who abandon me would, had I continued to be prosperous, never, perhaps, have dreamed of their own defection. There are vices and virtues which depend on circumstances. Our last trials were beyond all human strength. Besides, I was forsaken rather than betrayed. There was more of weakness than of perfidy around me. It was the denial of St. Peter. Tears and repentance are probably at hand. And where will you find, in the page of history, anyone possessing a greater number of friends and partisans, who was ever more popular and more beloved, who was ever more ardently and deeply regretted? Here from this very rock, on viewing the present disorders in France, who would not be tempted to say that I still reign there? The kings and princes, my allies, have remained faithful to me to the last. They were carried away by the people in a mass, and those who were around me found themselves overwhelmed and stunned by an irresistible whirlwind. No, human nature might have appeared in a more odious light, and I might have had greater cause of complaint. On the officers of the Emperor's household in 1814, plan of address to the King. 17th. The Emperor asked me some questions today relative to the officers of his household. With the exception of 2 or 3, at the most, who had drawn upon themselves the contempt of the very party to which they had gone over, nothing could be said against them. The majority had even evinced an ardent devotion to the Emperor's interests. The Emperor then made inquiries respecting some of these individuals in particular, calling them by their names, and I could not but express my approbation of them all. "What do you tell me?" said he, interrupting me hastily while I was speaking of one of them. "And yet I gave him so bad a reception at the Tuileries on my return. Ah, I fear I have committed some involuntary acts of injustice. This comes of being obliged to take for granted the first story that is told, and of not having a single moment to spare for verification. I fear, too, that I have left many debts of gratitude in arrear. How unfortunate it is to be incapable of doing everything oneself." I replied, "Sire, it is true that if blame be attached to the officers of your household, it must be shared equally by all, a fact, however, which must humble us strangely in the eyes of foreign nations." As soon as the king appeared, they hastened to him, not as to the sovereign whom your abdication had left us, but as to one who had never ceased to be our sovereign. Not with the dignity of men proud of having always fulfilled their duties, but with the equivocal embarrassment of unskilful courtiers. Each individual sought only to justify himself. Your Majesty was from that instant disavowed and abjured. The title of Emperor was dropped. The ministers, the nobles, the intimate friends of your Majesty styled you simply Bonaparte, and blushed not for themselves or their nation. They excused themselves by saying that they were compelled to serve, that they could not do otherwise through dread of the treatment they might have experienced. The Emperor here recognized a true picture of our national character. He said we were still the same people as our ancestors, the Ganls, that we still retained the same levity, the same inconstancy, and above all, the same vanity. "When shall we," said he, "exchange this vanity for a little pride?" "The officers of your Majesty's household," said I, "neglected a noble opportunity of acquiring both honour and popularity." There were above 150 officers of the household. A great number of them belonged to the first families, and were men of independent fortune. It was for them to have set an example, which being followed by others might have given another impulse to the national attitude, and afforded us a claim on public esteem. "Yes," said the Emperor, "if all the upper classes had acted in that way, affairs might have turned out very differently. The old editors of the public journals would not then have indulged in their chimeras of the good old times. We should not then have been annoyed with their dissertations on the straight line and the curved line. The king would have adhered honestly to his charter. I should never have dreamed of quitting the island of Elba. The head of the nation would have been recorded in history with greater honour and dignity, and we should all have been gainers." The Emperor's idea of reserving Corsica, his opinion of Robespierre, his idea respecting public opinion, expiatory intention of the Emperor with regard to the victims of the Revolution. 18th. After the accustomed occupation of the day, I accompanied the Emperor to the garden about 4 o'clock. He had just completed his dictation on the subject of Corsica. Having concluded everything he had to say relative to that island and to Paoli, he adverted to the interest which he himself excited there, while yet so young at the time of his separation from Paoli. He added that latterly he might to a certainty have united in his favour the wishes, the sentiments, and the efforts of the whole population of Corsica, and that, had he retired to that island on quitting Paris, he would have been beyond the reach of any foreign power whatever. He had an idea of doing so when he abdicated in favour of his son. He was on the point of reserving to himself the possession of Corsica during his life. No obstacle at sea would have obstructed his passage thither, but he abandoned that design for the sake of rendering his abdication the more sincere and the more advantageous to France. His residence in the centre of the Mediterranean, in the bosom of Europe, so near France and Italy, might have furnished a lasting pretext to the Allies. He even preferred America to England from the same motive and the same idea. It is true that in the sincerity of his own measures, he neither did nor could foresee his unjust and violent banishment to St. Helena. The Emperor next proceeded to take a review of different points of the Revolution, dwelt particularly on Robespierre, whom he did not know, but whom he believed to be destitute of talent, energy, or system. He considered him, notwithstanding, as the real scapegoat of the Revolution, sacrificed as soon as he attempted to arrest it in its course, the common fate, he observed, of all who, before himself, Napoleon, had ventured to take that step. The terrorists and their doctrine survived Robespierre, and if their excesses were not continued, it was because they were obliged to bow to public opinion. They threw all the blame on Robespierre, but the latter declared shortly before his death that he was a stranger to the recent executions, and that he had not appeared in the committees for 6 weeks previously. Napoleon confessed that while he was with the army of Nice, he had seen some long letters addressed by Robespierre to his brother, condemning the horrors of the commissioners of the Convention, who, as he expressed it, were ruining the revolution by their tyranny and atrocities. "Cambaceres, observed the Emperor, must be a good authority on subjects relating to that period, answered an inquiry which I one day addressed to him respecting the condemnation of Robespierre, in these remarkable words: 'Sire, that was a sentence without a trial,' adding that Robespierre had more foresight and conception than was generally imagined, that after he should have succeeded in subduing the unbridled factions which he had to oppose, his intention was to restore a system of order and moderation. Some time previous to his fall, added Cambaceres, he delivered a most admirable speech on this subject. It was not thought proper to insert it in the Moniteur, and all trace of it is now lost. This is not the first instance I have heard of omissions and want of accuracy in the Moniteur. In the reports inserted in that journal relative to the proceedings of the Assembly, there must be a period remarkable for incorrectness, as the minutes of these proceedings were for a time arbitrarily drawn up by one of the committees. Those who are induced to believe that Robespierre was at once wearied, satiated, and alarmed by the revolution, and had resolved on checking it, affirm that he would not take any decided step until after he had read his famous speech. He considered it so fine that he had no doubt of its effect on the Assembly. If this be true, his mistake or his vanity cost him dear. Those who think differently assert that Danton and Camille Desmoulins had precisely the same views, and yet that Robespierre sacrificed them. To these it is replied that Robespierre sacrificed them to preserve his popularity, because he judged that the decisive moment had not yet arrived, or because he did not wish to resign to them the glory of the enterprise. Be this as it may, it is certain that the nearer we approach to the instruments and the agents in that catastrophe, the greater obscurity and mystery we find, and this uncertainty will but increase with time. Thus, the page of history will on this point as on many others become the record, not so much of the events which really occurred, as of the statements which are given of them. In the course of our conversation relative to Robespierre, the Emperor said that he had been very well acquainted with his brother, the younger Robespierre, the representative to the army of Italy. He said nothing against this young man, whom he had inspired with great confidence and considerable enthusiasm for his person. Previously to the 9th of Thermidor, young Robespierre being recalled by his brother, who was then secretly laying his plans, insisted on Napoleon's accompanying him to Paris. The latter experienced the greatest difficulty in ridding himself of the importance, and at length only escaped it by requesting the interference of the General-in-Chief, Doumerlion, whose entire confidence he possessed, and who represented that it was absolutely necessary he should remain where he was. "Had I followed young Robespierre," said the Emperor, "how different might have been my career! On what trivial circumstances does human fate depend? Some office would doubtless have been assigned to me." and I might at that moment have been destined to attempt a sort of Vendémiaire. But I was then very young, my ideas were not yet fixed. It is probable, indeed, that I should not have undertaken any task that might have been allotted to me, but supposing the contrary case, and even admitting that I had been successful, what results could I have hoped for? In Vendémiaire the revolutionary fever was totally subdued. In Thermidor it was still raging in its utmost fury and at its greatest height. "Public opinion," said the Emperor on another occasion, when conversing on another subject, "is an invisible and mysterious power which it is impossible to resist. Nothing is more unsteady, more vague, or more powerful, and capricious as it may be, it is, nevertheless, just and reasonable more frequently than is supposed." On becoming provisional consul, the first act of my administration was the banishment of 50 anarchists. Public opinion, which had at first been furiously hostile to them, suddenly turned in their favour, and I was forced to retract. But some time afterwards, these same anarchists, having shown a disposition to engage in plots, were again assailed by that very public opinion, which had now returned to support me. Thus, through the errors that were committed at the time of the Restoration, popularity was secured to the regicides, who but a moment before had been proscribed by the great mass of the nation. "It belonged to me," continued the Emperor, "to shed a lustre over the memory of Louis XVI in France, and to purify the nation of the crimes with which she had been sullied by frantic acts and unfortunate fatalities. The Bourbons, being of the royal family, and coming from abroad, merely avenged their own private cause, and augmented the national opprobrium. I, on the contrary, being one of the people, should have raised the character of the nation by banishing from society, in her name, those whose crimes had disgraced her. This was my intention, but I proceeded prudently in the fulfilment of it. The 3 expiatory altars at St. Denis were but a prelude to my design. The Temple of Glory, on the site of the Magdalene, was to have been devoted to this object with still greater solemnity. There, near the tomb and over the very bones of the political victims of our revolution, human monuments and religious ceremonies would have consecrated their memory in the name of the French people. This is a secret that was not known to above 10 individuals, though it would have been necessary to communicate a hint of the design to those who might have been entrusted with the arrangement of the edifice. I should not have executed my scheme in less than 10 years, but what precautions had I not adopted? How carefully had I smoothed every difficulty and removed every obstruction? All would have applauded my design, and no one would have suffered from it. "So much depends on circumstances and forms," added he, "that in my reign Carnot would not have dared to write a memorial, boasting the death of the king, though he did so under the Bourbons. I should have leagued with public opinion in punishing him, while public opinion sided with him in rendering him unsaleable. Cascade at Briars. 19th. My son and I rose very early. Our task had been finished on the preceding day, and as the Emperor could not want me for some time, we availed ourselves of the fineness of the morning to explore the neighbourhood of our abode. Passing through the valley of Jamestown, on the right of our little level height at Briars, was a deep ravine, the sides of which were intersected by numerous perpendicular clefts. We descended into the ravine, not without difficulty, and found ourselves at the edge of a little limpid streamlet, beside which grew abundance of cresses. We amused ourselves by gathering them as we passed along, and after a few windings we soon reached the extremity of the valley and the streamlet, which are closed transversely by a huge pointed mass of rock, from the summit of which issues a pretty cascade produced from the waters of the surrounding heights. This waterfall, descending into the valley, forms the streamlet, along which we had just passed, and which sometimes rolls in a torrent to the sea. The water of the cascade was at this moment dispersed above our heads in small rain or light vapour, but in stormy weather it rushes forth in a torrent and furiously dashes through the ravine till it reaches the sea. To us the scene presented a gloomy, solitary and melancholy aspect, and it was altogether so interesting that we quitted it with regret. Today was Sunday, and we all dined with the Emperor. He good-humouredly observed that we formed a state party. After dinner, the circle of our amusements was not very extensive. He asked us whether we would have a comedy, an opera, or a tragedy. We decided in favour of a comedy, and he himself read a portion of Molière's Avare, which was continued by other individuals of the party. The Emperor had a cold, and was slightly feverish. He withdrew early from his walk in the garden, and desired me to see him again that evening if he should not have gone to bed. My son and I accompanied the rest of the gentlemen to the town, and on our return the Emperor had retired to rest. First and only excursion during our abode at Briars, the Admiral's Ball. 20th. The Emperor, after dictating as usual with one of the gentlemen, called me about 5 o'clock. He was alone, the rest of the gentlemen and my son having gone to the town, where the Admiral was that evening, to give a ball. The Emperor and I walked along the road leading to the town until we came within sight of the sea and shipping. On the left, in the depth of the valley, was a pretty little house. The Emperor stood for a considerable time with his glass at his eye, examining the garden, which appeared to be very well cultivated, and in which a group of beautiful children were at play, attended by their mother. We were informed that this house belonged to Major Hudson, a resident of the island, the same gentleman who had lent me the annual register. The house was situated at the bottom of the ravine which commences in the vicinity of Briars, and near the curious cascade which I have already noticed. The Emperor took a fancy to go down to the house, though it was now nearly 6 o'clock. The road was extremely steep. We found it longer and more difficult descent than we had expected, and we reached the bottom of the ravine quite out of breath. We took a survey of the little domain, which had evidently been laid out as the residence of a permanent occupant, and not as the mere temporary abode of a traveller passing to a foreign land, and after receiving the attentions of the master of the house and paying a few compliments to the mistress, the Emperor took his leave. But the evening was already far advanced, and we were very much fatigued. We therefore accepted the horses that were offered us, and speedily returned to our hut and our dinner. This little excursion, and the exercise of riding on horseback which had been so long relinquished, seemed to do the Emperor good. He desired that I would go to the Admiral's ball, in spite of my reluctance to leave him. At 8:30 o'clock he observed that the night was dark, the road bad, and that it was time I had set out. He insisted on my leaving him, and he entered his room, where I saw him undress and retire to bed. He again desired me to go, and I unwillingly obeyed. I left him alone, and thus for the first time violated a custom which had become most dear to me. I proceeded on foot to the town. The Admiral had given great éclat to his ball. It had been talked of for a considerable time before. He wished it to be understood that the entertainment was given solely on our account, and we had been formally invited. Was it most advisable to accept or to decline the invitation? Something might be said on both sides. Political misfortunes did not require that we should assume the appearance of domestic sorrow. It might be proper and even useful to mingle cheerfully in company with our jailers. We might, therefore, adopt either resolution indifferently. We determined to go. But what sort of conduct were we to observe? Should we assume pride or employ address? The first might be attended with inconvenience. In our situation, every wounded pretension became an insult. In the second, there could be no impropriety. To receive marks of politeness as though we were accustomed to them, and as though they were our due, and to overlook any little want of respect was certainly the wisest course. I arrived at the ball very late and left it very early. I was very much pleased with the entertainment in every respect. My conduct while the Emperor was at Elba. 21st to 2nd. The Emperor, who had often questioned me on the line of conduct pursued by many of his ministers, members of his council, and officers of his household, during his residence at the island of Elba, at length called me to account in my turn, saying, "But you yourself, Las Casas, what did you do after the arrival of the king? What happened to you all that time? Come, give me an account of your conduct. You know this is my way." And it is the only plan by which we can properly classify what we say or what we wish to learn. Besides, it will furnish you with another article for your journal. And, don't you see, added he jokingly, your biographers will only have the trouble of extracting, the thing will be already written to their hands. "Sire," I replied, "you shall have a literal statement of everything, though I have but little to say. I commanded on the 31st of March the 10th Legion of the National Guard of Paris, that which was appointed as the guard of the legislative body. We lost, during the day, a considerable number of men. At night I heard of the capitulation. I wrote to the officer next in rank to myself, and transferred to him the command of my legion, informing him that though in my quality of member of the Council of State I had previously received orders to proceed elsewhere, yet I had not wished to abandon my legion at the moment of danger, but that the event which had just occurred having changed the aspect of affairs, I must now proceed forthwith to fulfil new duties. At daybreak I set out on the road to Fontainebleau, and found myself in the midst of the wrecks of Marmont's and Mortier's detachments. I was on foot, but I doubted not I should be able to purchase a horse. I soon, however, discovered that soldiers in retreat are neither just nor civil. At that disastrous moment, my uniform of a National Guard was insulted, and I was myself ill-treated. After an hour's walk, overpowered by the fatigue of the journey, joined to the want of rest which I had experienced for 2 or 3 nights previously, seeing around me no face that I knew, and having no hope of procuring a horse, I determined, with a sorrowful heart, to return to the capital. The National Guard was ordered out to assist in the triumphant entry of the enemy. There was even a probability of its being selected as a guard of honour to the sovereigns who had conquered us. I determined to be absent from my home. I had conveyed my wife and children safely out of Paris a week or 2 before, and for a few days had recourse to the hospitality of a friend. I never went out of doors but in a shabby great-coat, visiting the coffee-houses and public places, and joining the different groups which were formed in the streets. My object was to make observations on persons and things, and above all to learn the real feelings of the people. How many extraordinary occurrences did I not witness in the course of my rambles! I saw, in front of the residence of the Emperor of Russia, men distinguished by their rank and calling themselves Frenchmen, exerting their utmost endeavours to induce the rabble to call out, "Long live Alexander, our deliverer!" I saw, sire, your monument on the Place Vendôme resist the efforts of a few wretches, belonging to the lowest dregs of the people, who had been hired by persons of note. Finally, in one of the corners of the Place Vendôme, before the hotel of the commandant of the place, I saw one of the officers of your household trying to prevail on young conscripts to enter another service than yours, but he received from them a lesson that might have made him blush for his own conduct. Doubtless, those to whom I here allude will exclaim that I mingled with the rabble, and yet it may be with justice affirmed that the acts of baseness which then disgraced France did not originate with the rabble. These acts were far from obtaining the countenance of the lower classes of the people. On the contrary, they were decidedly censured by the uprightness, generosity, and nobleness of sentiment manifested in the public streets. What reproaches might I not convey, were I to repeat all that I heard on this subject? Your Majesty abdicated. I had refused my signature to the Act of Adherence of the Council of State, but I thought I might make amends for this by an additional Act of Adherence. The Moniteur was every day filled with articles of this kind, yet mine was not deemed worthy the honour of insertion. At length the king arrived. He was henceforth our sovereign. He appointed a day for the reception of those individuals who had been presented to Louis XVI. I proceeded to the Tuileries to avail myself of this prerogative. What were my reflections on entering those apartments which had so lately been filled with your glory and power? And yet I presented myself to the king sincerely and in good faith. My foresight never led me even to think of your return. Deputations to the king were multiplied beyond number. A meeting of the officers of the naval establishment was proposed. To the person who communicated this fact to me, I replied that nothing could be more gratifying to my heart than to join my old comrades, none of whom could entertain sentiments purer than I did, but that the offices I had filled placed me in a peculiar and delicate situation, and that motives of prudence must deter me from appearing where the zeal of a president might lead him to employ expressions which I neither could nor would sanction by my opinion or presence. Subsequently, however, in spite of my mortification and disgust, I determined, at the solicitation of some friends, to think of something for myself. The Council of State was recomposed. Several members of the last council assured me, in spite of my recent conjectures on that point, that nothing was easier than to retain my office, that they had succeeded merely by an application to the Chancellor of France. I had not courage to venture a moment's encroachment on his lordship's time, and therefore contented myself with writing to acquaint him that I had been master of requests to the last Council of State, and if that circumstance were not sufficient to exclude me from becoming a member of the new assembly, I begged him to recommend me to the king as a councillor of state. I observed that I would not advance as claims to favour my 11 years' emigration or the loss of my patrimony in the king's cause. In these respects, I conceived I had only done my duty, which I had at all times, to the best of my knowledge, fulfilled faithfully and to the utmost. This language, as may well be supposed, deprived me even of the honour of a reply. Meanwhile, the new situation of Paris, the sight of the foreign troops, the acclamations of every kind, were more than I could endure. and I adopted the determination of going for a short time to London, where I should meet with old friends who might afford me all the consolation of which I was susceptible. Then, again, I recollected that I might find in London the same tumult and the same exultation that had driven me from Paris. This proved to be the fact. London was the scene of festivity and rejoicing, to celebrate the triumphs of the English and our humiliation. During my stay in London, the marine establishment was remodelled at Paris, and the Chevalier de Grimaldi, one of my old comrades, whom I had not seen or heard of for a length of time, was appointed a member of the committee. He called on my wife and expressed his surprise that I had not put in my claims, observing that I was entitled by law to return to the corps or to retire on a certain pension. He advised my wife to bring me to a decision on the subject and to rely on his friendship, adding that there was no time to be lost. I attached higher value to this mark of attention than to the favour which it was intended to procure me. However, I wrote to the committee, requesting that as I was desirous of wearing a uniform to which I had become attached, I might be allowed to enjoy the honorary title of Capitaine de Vaisseau, while at the same time I renounced the pension, to which I did not conceive myself entitled. I returned to Paris. The diversity of opinion and the irritation of the public mind were extreme. I had for a long time lived in the greatest retirement. I now confined myself entirely to the domestic circle of my wife and children. Never at any former period of my life did I prove myself a better husband or a better father, and never, perhaps, was I more physically happy. As I was one day reading, in the Journal des Débats, an account of a work of M. Beauchamp, I found mentioned the names of several gentlemen who were stated to have assembled on the Place Louis XV on the 31st March to excite sentiments in favour of royalty, and my name was among the number. It was in good company, no doubt, but at the same time the statement was untrue, and I should have been considerably lowered in the estimation of many if it had been believed. I wrote to request a correction of the error, which was calculated to render me the subject of congratulations to which I was in no way entitled. I observed that it was out of my power to have acted in the way described, whatever might have been my inclination. As the commander of a legion of the National Guard, I had contracted obligations from which no consideration on earth could free me, and I sent my letter to the Deputy Chapeau-Latour, one of the proprietors of the Journal des Débats, a man for whom I entertained a great esteem. He declined publishing my letter, purely from good intentions towards me. I then addressed it to the editor, but he refused to insert it on account of difference of opinion. Meanwhile, the state of the public mind indicated an inevitable and speedy catastrophe. Everything foreboded that the Bourbons would share the fate of the Stuarts. My wife and I used every evening to amuse ourselves in reading Hume's History of England. We began at Charles I, and Your Majesty arrived before we had got to James II. Here the Emperor could not repress his laughter. Your Majesty's advancement and arrival, continued I, were to us a subject of the greatest astonishment and anxiety. I was far from foreseeing the honourable voluntary exile which it would gain for me in the end, for I was then unknown to your Majesty, and circumstances arising out of that event alone brought me to your presence. Had I filled the most trivial post under the King, had I even been a frequent attendant at the Tuileries, which would have been very natural and consistent with propriety, I should not have appeared for a length of time in your Majesty's presence. Not, indeed, that I should have had anything to reproach myself with, or that my attachment to you would have been the less sincere, but because I should not have wished to pass for a piece of court furniture, or to seem always ready to offer incense at the shrine of power. I should have awaited an appointment, instead of pressing forward to solicit one. But as it was, I felt myself so much at liberty, everything about me was in such perfect harmony, that I seemed to form a part of the great event. I, therefore, eagerly hastened to meet the first glance of your Majesty. I felt as though I had claims on your kindness, and, on your return from Waterloo, the same sentiments brought me immediately and spontaneously near your person, which I have never since quitted. If I was then attracted by your public glory, I am now attached by your private virtues, and if it be true that the gratification of my feelings then cost me some sacrifice, I now find myself repaid 100-fold by the happiness I enjoy in being able to tell you so. It would, however, be difficult to describe the extreme disgust I felt at everything during the 10 months of your absence. I felt an utter contempt for mankind and worldly vanities. Every illusion was destroyed, all interest had vanished, Everything appeared to be at an end, or to be undeserving of the smallest value. During my emigration, I had received the Cross of St. Louis. An ordinance decreed that it was to be legitimized by a new brevet. I had not spirit to put in my claim. Another ordinance directed that the titles bestowed by Your Majesty should be sent in to be confirmed, but I felt indifferent with regard to compromising those which I had obtained during the Empire. In fine, I received a letter from the Marine Department informing me that my captain's commission had just been forwarded thither, and there it still remains. Your Majesty's absence was to me a widowhood, the affliction and grief of which I concealed from no one. But on your return, I was repaid for all by the testimony borne by those who surrounded you, and to whom I had previously been scarcely known. At Your Majesty's first levee, the individual who was ad interim at the head of the Department of Foreign Affairs, coming from the presence, took me aside to a window, and told me to go home and prepare, as I should probably have to set out on a journey. He had just said, proposed me to Your Majesty, adding that he had represented me as a madman, but mad for love of you. I wished to know whither I was to be sent, but that, he said, he neither would nor could tell me. I never heard anything more of the matter. M. Vagnon de Saint-Jean d'Angers placed me on the list of the imperial commissioners whom Your Majesty sent to the departments. I assured him that I was ready to do anything, but I observed that I was noble and an emigrant, and that these 2 words pronounced by the first comer would be sufficient to annul me, in case of necessity, at any time or in any place. He acknowledged the justice of my observation, and relinquished his intention. A senator next solicited that Your Majesty would appoint me to the prefecture of Metz, his native town. He requested me to make this sacrifice for only 3 months, in order, as he said, to conciliate the popular mind, and set things to rights. At length Decres and the Duke of Bassano proposed me as a councillor of state, and, the 3rd day after your arrival, Your Majesty signed my appointment. 23rd. The Emperor was still indisposed. He confined himself to his room, and would see nobody. He sent for me at 9 o'clock in the evening. I found him very low-spirited and melancholy. He scarcely spoke to me, and I did not dare to say anything to him. If I regarded his illness as merely physical, it grieved me sincerely. If he laboured under mental affliction, how much more was I grieved that I could not employ all the resources of consolation with which the heart naturally overflows for those whom we truly love. The Emperor dismissed me in about half an hour. 24th. The Emperor continued indisposed, and still declined seeing anybody. He sent for me to dine with him at a late hour. Dinner was served on a little table beside the sofa on which he was lying. He ate heartily. He said that he stood in need of some sudden revulsion of the constitution, which he should soon obtain, so well did he understand his own temperament. After dinner he took up the memoirs of Marshal de Villars, which amused him. He read aloud many passages, which revived former recollections, and gave rise to many anecdotes. The Emperor's temperament, riding, notions of medicine. 25th. The Emperor still continued unwell. He had passed a bad night. At his desire, I dined with him beside the sofa, which he was unable to leave. He was, however, evidently much better. He had a heap of books scattered around him on the sofa. The rapidity of his imagination, the fatigue of dwelling always on the same subject, or of reading what he already knew, caused him to take up and throw down the books one after another. At length he fixed on Rossini's Iphigenia, and amused himself by pointing out the beauties and discussing the few faults to be found in that work. He dismissed me at an early hour. Contrary to the general opinion, in which I myself once participated, the Emperor is far from possessing a strong constitution. His limbs are large, but his fibres are relaxed. With a very expanded chest, he is constantly labouring under the effects of cold. His body is subject to the influence of the slightest accidents. The smell of paint is sufficient to make him ill. Certain dishes, or the slightest degree of damp, immediately take a severe effect on him. His body is far from being a body of iron, as is generally supposed. All his strength is in his mind. His prodigious exertions abroad, and his incessant labours at home, are known to everyone. No sovereign ever underwent so much bodily fatigue. The most remarkable instance of the Emperor's activity and exertion was his ride without stirrups from Valladolid to Burgos, a distance of 35 Spanish leagues in 5 hours and a half, that is to say, upwards of 7 leagues an hour. The Emperor had set out accompanied by a numerous escort, in case of danger from the guerrillas, but at every yard he left some of his company behind him, and he arrived at Burgos with but few followers. His ride from Vienna to the Simmering, a distance of 18 or 20 leagues, is also frequently talked of. The emperor rode to breakfast at the Simmering and returned to Vienna immediately after. Napoleon often hunted to the distance of 38 leagues and never less than 15.